We continue with our sort of module, I guess, 2-week module on migration. And I actually, I realized after ending last class lecture that I actually did not make explicit enough, I think, the reasons why Mexico's attempt to draw immigrants in the second half of the 19th century actually failed, if I remember correctly, right? So why did those efforts fail? Why do you think these efforts failed? Why was it? Why there were some immigrants, right, that went to Mexico in that period, but it was actually there were actually very small numbers compared to the flows that were coming to the U.S., Canada, Argentina, Australia. So why do you think these efforts failed on the part of the sort of political and economic elites that were trying to draw immigrants? What was that?
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask, should we expect any changes to class next?
Say that I couldn't.
Should we expect any changes to class next week?
As far as the lecture, no. No. I'll be here lecturing. So there might be other changes. I have to see what's coming our way first. Fully, yeah. No, thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm answering sort of to the best of my knowledge and capacity as of now, right? So this is in relation as to likely strike of the academic workers, right? Graduate students, researchers, etc., and how that can impact and will likely impact our classes, right, in general. So we're in a class where we have actually the benefit of a teaching assistant, a graduate student worker, and yeah. So as far as the lecture, things will continue, sort of, let's say, normal. If anything can be called normal these days, but yeah. Thank you. So, any answers to my question? Why did those efforts fail to attract immigrants? Why do you think? Why was Mexico less successful? Right, obviously less successful than all these other countries, right? Neighboring countries, right, or countries even in the same continent. However you want to put it, right? Any guesses? Informed guesses at this point? Because we have talked about what happened in Mexico in the 19th century, right? This is even connected to our sort of brief discussion on the world's fairs, right? Because remember the famous world fairs that were happening already in the sort of second half of the 19th century, early 20th century, and how Mexico wanted to participate in those world fairs to present itself, right? The Mexican government, etc., wanted to participate in these events, organized mostly either in Europe or in the United States, to present a kind of like a particular face, right, of the country, a country that, among other things, would welcome certain kinds of immigrants, right, that was in the process of becoming sort of a modern nation with opportunities, right, et cetera, et cetera. But and yet failed. Did you raise your hand, right? Yeah.
Just in regards to your question, because they failed to attract the European Catholics, because the Mexicans were open to Chinese invasion, and that's because the U.S. banned the Chinese from coming in, but Mexico didn't.
So it's not that Mexico was happy with, like these elites were super happy with Chinese immigrants. It's that Chinese immigrants got deflected to Mexico in a way, right? And so remember, it's interesting because Mexico had a very sort of, again, when we say Mexico, I feel a little uncomfortable just saying Mexico. Mexico is, these political and economic elites, right, were actually trying to attract a particular profile of immigrant, right? And it's not that they had open doors to everybody. This is a very important point, right? They were very sort of selective, if you will, right? There was a particular selectivity that the Mexican state, the Mexican government, and economic elites at the time was kind of like sort of fishing for, if you will, right? Metaphorically speaking. Yes, over there.
Could it be that, like it says that the Mexican government sought out specifically the Europeans, but did that reflect like what local Mexicans also believed in, or like were there these kind of just separate?
Well, I'm not sure that, local Mexicans, if you mean sort of kind of like working class or other sectors of the Mexican population were very that interested, right? This was an elite project, I would say, right? In many ways, this was an elite project in the United States too, right? Think about the latter part of the 19th century. It probably if you ask, an average, whatever that really means, right? Average person in the United States in 1880, right? A lot of people, would not even be in favor of any immigration, right? Or if you think about 1920. So, But why do you think it failed? Why weren't these elites successful in terms of attracting large numbers of immigrants? Any guesses? Well, remember, Mexico had been a tremendously unstable country, right? In a very unstable situation for most of the 19th century. And of course, that did not help Mexico in terms of this sort of competition for immigrants, right? Even despite the fact that a lot of the migration that was happening in the world, let's say, once again, generally speaking, in the second half of the 19th century, right, the second half of the 1800s, had to do mostly with push factors, things that were creating instability in the countries or lands of origin of immigrants, right? And of course, it did not help Mexico's case the fact that they were trying to be kind of like hyper-selective, right? We'll get into, in just a few minutes into, what happened kind of like after the revolution, right? But again, there were, if you think about the United States, of course, there were Catholics and Protestants and Jews and lots of different people coming, right? Again, not all of them sort of necessarily sort of welcome, or received in the same way, right? But, this kind of very specific profile, right? Mexican elites wanted white people coming from Europe, and who on top of that, they were Catholic, right? Who were preferably Catholic. And of course, that also had to do with that sort of experience earlier in the first half of the 19th century, during the first half of the 1800s, when German Protestants, German immigrants, and mostly Protestants settled in Texas, and then they ended up seceding, right, separating from Mexico, right? So there was, in that sense, a kind of, as we said last class, a kind of sort of ambivalence, right? We want immigrants, but only certain kind of immigrants, right? Not everybody, because what happened and other reasons. But also this chaotic situation, this instability in Mexico, right, in the 19th century did not help Mexico's case, right? Because, this idea of going to a place that was, going through all this turmoil as Mexico experienced in the 19th century was not always sort of appealing, right, to would-be immigrants. Now, we said it, well, in the previous slide you saw that there was some Chinese migration to Mexico, deflected in part by the U.S. banning Chinese immigration. Chinese migration continued to the United States despite the ban, right? But with a number of the ban did have a number of consequences. It made migrating or moving to the United States very difficult for Chinese immigrants, right? I told the story last class of how they had to come through Mexico, especially through this part of Mexico closest to us here, right? Baja California, Sonora, that sort of part of northwestern Mexico. I told you how this sort of Mexican smuggling industry actually got started, not with Mexican undocumented workers, but actually with banned Chinese immigrants, right? Because Mexicans did not face any restriction in terms of moving back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico at that time, right? This comes much later in history, let's say, right? Now, a series of very interesting developments happened after the revolution, right? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. The post-revolutionary state was actually, despite its sort of economic and socially progressive agenda, was not on board with receiving Chinese immigrants, right? And this is where, in response to one of the questions, your question about how would regular people react to migration, to respond to migration, we can see in the post-revolutionary period how there are actually sort of discussions, debates in Mexico about so-called unfair competition on the part of Chinese migrants and laborers, not unlike those that happened in the United States a few years earlier, right? Because that was the impetus or one of the reasons or excuses for the 1882-1883 ban on Chinese immigration to the United States, right? So something similar begins to happen in Mexico, right? This is what's the period that I'm talking about here? Well, 1920s, 1920s, 1930s, 1920s for sure, when this sort of post-revolutionary state actually begins to close the door to Chinese migration/immigration, right? And so, again, there were complaints about unfair competition on the part of Chinese migrants and merchants and laborers who had settled in Mexico, and then very sort of, where have I heard that before, type of discussions about Chinese immigrants being unassimilable, not and undesirable for intermarriage, right? So this is we can see in here a kind of beginning of immigration restriction in Mexico. Okay, it sort of started with Chinese immigrants, but also extended, especially by the late 20s, early 30s, to exclude other potential immigrants, right? Other people who were on the move at that time: Jews, Eastern Europeans, Arabs, blacks, or people of African origin or descent. And the Mexican case is extremely interesting because this is, once again, not on the one hand not exclusive to Mexico, right? Those who have taken the courses on immigration in sociology or maybe another department know that by 1924, right, 1924, the U.S. Congress actually passes an immigration act that closes the door to immigration from pretty much the entire world, but particularly Europe and Southern Europe to the United States, right? That's 1924. The arguments are perhaps not familiar to folks here, right? There was a lot of racist, racialized language that was sort of mobilized in order to justify kind of like closing the door, right, to immigration, right? Again, if you've taken SOS 152 or 150 or 151 or 152, you'll probably be familiar with this, right? And so it's interesting because the post-revolutionary leaders, right, the intellectuals of the post-revolutionary government, of the new regime, the new state in Mexico, also sort of invoke these sort of racist arguments, right, or racialized arguments as to why, not accepting or closing the doors to all of these, different sort of categories of immigrants, right? Where did that come from? Well, not unlike what was happening in the US, as I already said, the Mexican scientific and intellectual elites were also part of this sort of larger intellectual or epistemic community that actually fundamentally embrace what is known or what is called scientific racism, right? What is scientific racism? Anybody? Anyone? What's scientific racism? I'm sure you've discussed this in other classes. Yes?
Is it like trying to justify racism with like biological evidence, supposedly, quote unquote?
Exactly, right? Trying to justify, create a kind of construct about the sort of objective scientific underpinnings of racial hierarchies, right, in society with the support of scientific arguments, right, scientific evidence, scientific methods, etc., etc. But absolutely right. Now, as you know, I'm sure pretty much everybody knows in this room that in the late 19th century, early first half of the 20th century, scientific racism was a globally, pretty much globally, I would say, internationally at least, accepted ideology, right, and doctrine, right? So people in governments, in universities, in many quarters, many spaces, actually believe this idea, right? That the so-called human race or human species was actually organized in a series of in a hierarchy of races, right? Going from those that are superior races to those that are inferior races, right? This is actually a sort of an intrinsic quality, right, of racism in general, but scientific racism in particular, right? It's not just this idea that human societies or the human species or whatever is sort of divided in a series of races that are on a horizontal level or plane, right? Everybody's kind of like the same. It's just that each one has its own little box. No. Racism is fundamentally predicated in scientific. Racism is fundamentally predicated on the basis of a hierarchy, right? There's some at the top, there's some at the bottom, some in the kind of like in the middle, right? So, yeah, and there is an unsurprising aspect of this, right? This was established sort of scientific practice and belief, right? That was, if you go to, universities in Britain or in France or in the United States or in many other parts of the world, you will find in the university libraries, probably now in storage, maybe not in the main bookshelves of those libraries, tons and tons of theses and dissertations that were written on the basis of scientific racism, right? With this idea that, people who have certain biological and cultural attributes belong to such and such race, and that race is positioned to be a superior race and to therefore lead the rest of the races, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But there was the Mexican version of this, of what I just told you, is quite peculiar at the same time. And I'm going to explain why. It fundamentally had to do, or it could be characterized as a kind of anti-racist racism. What do I mean by that? Already in the late 1800s, right? Under the government of Porfirio Diaz, right? You guys remember that name? There were efforts on the part of intellectuals, political and social leaders in Mexico to think about, they were thinking about the kind of sort of racial distinctiveness or racial peculiarity of Mexicans, right? Racially speaking, what was the sort of Mexican nation kind of like all about, right? This sort of effort, right, was kind of continued during and after the Mexican Revolution. And these sort of intellectuals before and after the revolution in Mexico came up with this interesting idea that the Mexican nation, racially speaking, was characterized by racial mixing, right? What was that racial mixing? Well, in Spanish, it's called mestizaje. So you're gonna hear me talk about mestizaje, the mixing of races, right? That's what it means. So these Mexican intellectuals, right? Writers, professors in universities, people in the Ministry of Education, et cetera, right? Embrace this idea that the Mexican nation, it's a nation that is composed of the blending or mixing of two races, the European race, so to speak, race, through the Spaniards or to Spain, right? And indigenous Mexicans. That is sort of the kind of the vintage, right? The fundamental sort of blend of that constitutes the Mexican and fundamentally characterizes the Mexican nation, right? We are a mixed race nation. That in principle looks very inclusive, right? Remember that the rest of the Western world, if you will, was actually, and particularly these scientific races, right? That were firmly ensconced in universities and governments, et cetera, were completely against the mixing of races, right? For these elites, this mixing of races, miscegenation, was the way to degrade and spoil the purity of the superior races, right? So these, people think about, like, once again, right? Harvard or Princeton or Paris or London or any place in sort of the Western countries that were actually also producers of this ideology of scientific racism and practice of scientific racism were completely against racial miscegenation, right? But here we have, Mexico coming up with this idea that kind of like racial mixing is a good thing, right? We're the product of a racial mix, right? We're the product of mestizaje. And once again, it looks like a pretty cool thing, right? in that, well, it includes the sort of native population of Mexico, right? Indigenous groups, et cetera, plus those who came a few centuries before from Europe and conquered, right? But it also has a very exclusionary side, right? If you think about the history of what we call today Mexico, right? Or think about just 100 years ago, right? 1920. Think about the history of Mexico up until that period. If we think about this notion of the Mexican nation characterized by the blending or mixing of indigenous populations and Europeans, who is left out of the picture? There's at least, if not more than, at least one or more than one major sort of contributors to, the Mexican socio-demographic makeup, right? Through colonial times, through post-independence, et cetera, et cetera. Who's left out of this notion of particular notion of mestizaje? It's a particular notion of mestizaje, right? The Mexican post-revolutionary elites were not saying people came from all over the world, and that's why that's the result of that wonderful mixing is Mexico and Mexicans, right? They had a very kind of specific idea, right? Europeans and indigenous population. That's Mexico.
Excluded, wouldn't it be like Africans?
During colonial times, at some point during the colonial period, there were more people from Africa than Europeans in Mexico. Many more. People who came enslaved, people who actually came, people from Africa or African descent who came actually free, and who actually were free, I guess just to use the word, citizens, let's say. It's a little bit of an awkward term to use. Yes?
So in terms of slavery in Mexico, was slavery more similar to like the Latin American countries rather than the U.S.?
Latin American countries have a great variety of experiences, right? Number one.
There was free people in Mexico, there was free black people in Mexico?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And it's a very interesting topic. It's a growing body of research about the experience of Africans, forced and I guess voluntary or not forced migrants, right? Some who first migrated to Spain and re-migrated then to Mexico often came as free individuals, right? There is some, and then conditions in Mexico also varied greatly, or the New Spain, to be more appropriate, right? There were people those who came enslaved and worked in plantations had obviously one kind of experience. Free individuals who work, for example, in commerce or in all the trade that was connected to kind of like intra-imperial trade, and who were navigators or work on merchant vessels, had a very different experience, right? But yes, very good point. From this notion of mestizaje, Africans and Mexicans of African descent are completely erased, completely out of the picture, right? Remember that during the colonial period, there was also Asian migration from Asia, right? Because of the Spanish colonial empire, we touched on this briefly in class, right? There was a very active trade going from the port of Acapulco in southern Mexico through the Galeon de Manila going to the Philippines, right? And so on the way back from the Philippines, right, bringing all those goods that were coming from China through the Philippines to the Americas, there were also people, right? A lot of people from the Filipino or Philippine archipelago who would end up staying in Mexico, right? So anyway, it's interesting, right? Because yes, mestizaje, yes, a kind of sort of mixing, blending of races, but some folks, right, some groups are kind of erased, from the picture, right? They're not part of this sort of fundamental notion. So it's a notion, right, of racial blending that is inclusive but also exclusive at the same time. It's a notion also of mestizaje that is not free of a kind of sort of racial bias, right? It was seeped into scientific racism because that notion of mestizaje still believed or was, infused with the idea that Europeans were superior, right? And that the indigenous people had to be made like the Europeans. They had to be acculturated. They had to be assimilated. They had to be fundamentally transformed so they would cease being indigenous and they would be more like the sort of the European counterpart. Okay? So it wasn't a kind of egalitarian notion of mestizaje either, right? Because it still had embedded that notion of racial superiority. Okay, interrupt me if you have any questions. So it's interesting. It makes the kind of like Mexican case in terms of immigration and race and these kinds of discussions. Yeah, once again, quite interesting, right? Because to Americans, right, to the economic and political and some of the intellectual elites and some of the, I guess, rank and file Americans, Mexicans, in fact, represented a kind of anti-ideal, right? Because Mexicans were called a mongrel race in, the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Like the kind of racial blending that we don't want, right? Because it spoils the superior race, right? This was Mexico and Mexicans in the eyes of many in the U.S. So it's a very peculiar kind of anti-racism that is, at the end of the day, not really anti-racist at all, right? Because it was also used to exclude immigrants, right? That were sometimes deflected from the U.S. Or who might have wanted to migrate to Mexico, right? And often the vocabulary, right, the lexicon, the language that was used to justify exclusion, right, restriction from immigration was this language of, well, these immigrants, they just keep to themselves. A very sort of familiar discourse, because this is the discourse that has been used forever in the U.S., right? These immigrants, this particular immigrant group, they just keep to themselves. They don't want to intermarry. So it's interesting because then you put the racism on the immigrant, right? It's the immigrant who's the racist, and they don't want to intermarry, right? They kind of like keep to themselves. They practice endogamic marriage. They are not interested in integrating and assimilating to the larger society. Remember that intermarriage is a sort of a fundamental path, right, and pattern for these sorts of processes. So it's interesting. Once again, you kind of like put the blame on the victim in a way, right? Yes.
Yeah, so they're blaming the immigrants for being racist because they don't want to come fully to the country because they know they're not gonna have a chance to immigrate.
No, because they come, but then they just form their own kind of like enclaves and colonies, and they don't really intermarry with the rest of the population. but in fact, this is, widespread, right? Kind of like everybody does that, right? Especially in the first generation, right? Intermarriage is something that happens with the second and subsequent generations across the board, right? So, anyway, before and during World War II, and this is actually a very important point, Mexico took some Jewish refugees, right? People fleeing Europe, the advance of fascism and Nazism in Europe, but also turned away many of them, actually just like the United States, right? Mexico and the US famously turned away many Jewish immigrants, actually, who subsequently died, actually, in extermination camps in Europe. However, there's a very interesting sort of episode that I want to spend a little bit more time discussing, which is the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Mexico actually took several thousand Spanish refugees, mostly not surprisingly coming from the losing side, right? Those the Republican side, right, of the Spanish Civil War, which lost the war to Franco, right, to Franquismo in 1939, right? Many of them went to other parts of Europe. There was a big migration of Spanish refugees to France, for example, neighboring country, at the end of the day. But also many sought refuge in Latin America, and Mexico took between 20 and 24,000 Spanish immigrants, refugees. This case is actually super interesting, right? Because several decades later, right, Mexico was getting what they wanted, essentially Spanish Catholics, right? And in that sense, these refugees, right, that were fleeing Franco and Franquismo in Spain, they really fit into the Mexican notion of mestizaje, right? Spaniards, indigenous, right? Europeans and indigenous, right? And largely, if not very active in religious terms, culturally Catholic, right? This is super interesting because for decades, the Mexican government, the Mexican state, has sort of used this episode as a to kind of burnish its image as a kind of generous, open country to refugee flows. We took the Spaniards who were fleeing Europe from Big Bad Wolf Franco, and we gave them, open doors. A lot of children actually came through that sort of refugee flow, right? It's just, the parents, seeing, disaster descending upon them. The first thing that they wanted to do is to put their children in a sort of safe place, safe condition. And so actually many of those ships that actually came from Spain actually had a lot of what today we would call unaccompanied minors, right? Welcomed by the Mexican government, right? At the same time that this was happening, Mexico continued its restriction towards Arabs, Jews, blacks, Roma or Gypsies, Eastern Europeans, South Asians, people from India, from the southern part of Asia, Chinese, etc., etc. I was going to say something else in relation to the Spaniards that came. Oh, the other thing that it's not on that slide is that the Spanish, that Spanish flow, that Spanish stream of refugees had, in addition to the things that I already said, had more interesting characteristics in terms of their selectivity. They were mostly middle-class people, right, from the cities in Spain, right? And many of those folks were actually, broadly speaking, intellectuals, right? People who were artists, professors in universities, and so forth and so on. And it actually, culturally, intellectually, left a big mark on Mexico in this sort of period, right? We're talking about the late 30s, but going on to the 40s, 50s, et cetera, these people stayed in Mexico. They couldn't go back to Spain, right? Franco died in 1975, so they pretty much had to stay in Mexico, and many of them ended up staying. If you watch movies from the so-called golden age of Mexican cinema, which is 30s, 40s, 50s, that golden age starts to kind of end in the 60s. But if from the late 30s to throughout the 50s, especially if you pay close attention and if you know Spanish, you will see that there are a lot of actors, not necessarily the main characters, but a lot of actors that play supporting roles, right, in the movies that have a slight Spanish accent. It's very interesting. They, of course, as actors, they work hard to kind of standardize their, Spanish, kind of like an international, or approach it to the kind of like Mexican accent or one of the Mexican accents. But you can still hear them. You can still hear So a lot of these actors actually were from Spain and came during this period. But there were writers, there were painters, there were, scientists, and so forth and so on. So the flow was not particularly huge. These are really just a few thousand people. They had all these sort of characteristics that make them fit into the notion of mestizaje that the Mexican state and its organic intellectuals were kind of embracing and pitching. And on top, they had a kind of socioeconomic selectivity, right, that turned them into a kind of sort of asset, right, for Mexico. They would fall under the kind of sort of skilled side of the spectrum, right, when we think about immigration. Andrew.
Maybe I'm misremembering, but I thought the chapter highlighted this was kind of an example of like the fact that these Spanish refugees would actually compete for different types of economic jobs in Mexico is an example of immigration policy not being rooted in sort of economic imperatives and being tied to,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a totally valid point. Yeah, it was more of a kind of political juncture, right? Political sort of reasoning, and but I think that this is also. So the basic point is correct, I think, or at least I agree with that. That this was not the fact that they came from that these immigrants refugees had this particular socioeconomic profile was a kind of added bonus, but it was not the reason why Mexico opened the doors to them, right? It was more of a sort of a political, ideological, cultural reason, right? I mean, we can create a kind of counterfactual situation, right? Hypothetical. Imagine some kind of, which actually, did happen, right? A kind of, big sort of socioeconomic, political turmoil in China, right? During the same period, right? Which actually was a period of heightened turmoil in Asia, in East Asia, right? Japan is invading various parts of East Asia, you name it, right? There's all sorts of things. And you have, 20 to 25,000 Chinese migrants, right, who wanted to escape and find safe haven, right? It's very doubtful that the Mexican government, the Mexican state would have said, oh yeah, come in, right? We are a generous nation open to refugees. They would have been much more reluctant. And I have such an example, not as a counterfactual, not as a hypothetical, but as a real thing, which is the next slide. A couple of slides now. Mexico, like other countries, of course, changed position or sort of stance ideologically and politically speaking at the end and after World War II, right? Of course, after the horrors of Nazism in Europe, which were justified on the basis of scientific racism. Scientific racism went into sort of disrepute, right? And a lot of people rejected scientific racism as a essentially evil ideology and pseudoscience in addition, very important, right? That there were actually no real scientific foundations to really articulate a kind of, racially organized society, etc., etc. But Mexico's move to a kind of more anti-racist stance also had to do with the way Mexico positioned itself vis-a-vis the U.S. This is actually very important. Remember that after World War II, before, but certainly after World War II, the U.S. is going through political and social turmoil, right? That had to do with racism, right? The civil rights struggle, right? And so for the Mexican post-revolutionary state, especially after World War II, embracing a kind of, at least discursively, a kind of anti-racist ideology was a way of saying the racists are north of the Rio Grande, right? The racists are in the United States. The US is a racist country. We are not a racist country, right? We are open-minded, Look at the example of the Spanish refugees, right? We're not racist, they are racist, right? Now, who led this sort of policy of bringing in these refugees? Our good old friend, Lázaro Cárdenas, right? Right there in the middle of the picture, right? President of Mexico from 1934 to 1940, right? You can see, actually, I was telling you about all these kids, right, that came unaccompanied, right, on ships, just like fleeing the advances of the Franquista army in Spain, right? Some of their parents, came in later, etc., etc. But some didn't. Now, what do we have here? I like to use these examples, very different examples of immigration and particularly kind of like refugee migration that happened in more recent years in Mexico. So basically during the 1970s and 1980s, Mexico received other waves of refugees, right? Central American and particularly Guatemalan refugees during the Guatemalan Civil War and successive military governments that engaged in widespread repression against indigenous Guatemalan communities, right? And that sort of dynamic, socio-political dynamics in Guatemala actually produced a flow of refugees to Mexico, right? That's one of the things that happens with refugees. They, not always, but they often, as they try to escape violence, they go to the closest safe haven, right? And Mexico, of course, being the closest safe haven, received a lot of Guatemalan refugees, indigenous Guatemalans. The Mexican government did everything possible to keep those refugees from integrating into Mexican society. First of all, they kept them relatively isolated in southern Mexico, right? In refugee camps, number two. And there are some accounts by scholars who were studying the phenomenon at that time that even officials of the Mexican civil registry would deny extending birth certificates to the children of Guatemalan migrants, refugees, despite the fact that by Mexican law, by the Mexican Constitution, anybody who's born on Mexican soil is a Mexican, right? So they would make everything difficult for these families to obtain, legal documentation that their children were born in Mexican territory and therefore entitled to Mexican citizenship. Mexico worked closely with the UN to implement and do a lot of these things, right? Meaning keep these refugees more or less restricted to a certain area, right, in Mexico, and not really kind of like launching some kind of big campaign to integrate them into Mexican society. Basically waiting for conditions to change in Guatemala so they could go back. Compare that with a smaller and different stream of refugees coming from South America who were fleeing military juntas, dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, right? Starting roughly around 1976, right? That's the year of the military coup in Argentina. Well, before that, Chile in 1973, right? And so, these refugees, of course, begin to they try to find safe haven. Chileans who first experienced the military coup, right, the Pinochet coup in 1973, escaped to Argentina, many of them, right? But then there was a coup in Argentina in 76, and the two dictatorships worked closely to track dissidents, right, and members of the opposition, find them, detain them, and in many cases kill them, right, killing them. And so, Chileans who had fled to Argentina then ended up fleeing to, going to Mexico, Argentinian members of the opposition as well, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a little bit of a repeat of 1939, right? Once again, Mexico sort of had this sort of opportunity to appear as this sort of generous country with, that had sort of opened doors to these people, fleeing persecution, right? But these two streams were received in Mexico with very different strategies, right? The folks that were coming from South America, right? Many of them members of the middle classes in their countries of origin, right? Phenotypically white, artists, scientists, professors, etc., were integrated very quickly, actually, into the educational, apparatus of Mexico, right? I actually, when I was an undergraduate student in Mexico, had many professors who were from Argentina, particularly, not so many Chileans, but from a good number of folks who were from Argentina who had fled Argentina in the 70s, right? Because they, the police, the military was after them. Most of these migrations stayed in Mexico City, but it really went to other cities in the country as well, right? Because, going to, taking jobs at universities in different parts of the country, et cetera, et cetera. You would, despite the thousands of Guatemalans who fled Guatemala in the late 70s, early 80s, it would be hard for you to find a Guatemalan refugee in northern Mexico. Why? Because of the effort of the Mexican government to keep this migration, right, constrained and limited, right? Basically preventing it from integrating into the rest of the country. Okay, before we go to the questions. Any questions on this stuff? So Mexico complains a lot about the U.S. in terms of migration, right? All the time. But it's not that Mexico has a much better policy or has had a better policy,
So
right?
can we find a connection with what is happening when all the Honduras and El Salvador immigrants are starting to flee as well? Like, do we have that is happening this again?
It's happening again, yes.
This time, and
Yes.
it's not working better, or how can we put like what is going on?
We'll talk about these mostly next week, for sure. We're going to address that, this topic, for sure, yeah. And this is Bemitzi is actually talking about, something that's happening as we speak, right? New streams of Central American migration coming through Mexico, trying to mostly reach the United States, right, in the form of caravans or less sort of organized forms of migration. Actually, that Central American migration has been going on for decades. Now, even, of course, after peace agreements in Central America, all these different things. I don't know if I should call it necessarily a new thing, but certainly more explicit thing is that the U.S. is putting a lot of pressure on Mexico to keep those migrants from actually reaching the U.S.-Mexico border, right? Because those migrants are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and claiming asylum, right? And so the different administrations in the U.S. Recently also have sort of different stances vis-a-vis, the right of asylum, right? The Trump administration very sort of clearly engaged, taking advantage also of the pandemic of, let's keep, we cannot take anybody because of the pandemic, et cetera, keep them in Mexico, but at the same time pursued a very aggressive policy vis-a-vis Mexico so that Mexico would block those flows as much as possible, right? I'm talking specifically about 2018, 2019, but this is a policy that extends to the present, right? The Biden administration has had sort of a little bit more sort of flexibility in the sense that the pandemic ended, the emergency ended, and has been taking more people in terms of, giving them kind of like a provisional status while their asylum hearings take place, right? Because we're talking about thousands of people going through this sort of system. That's in a nutshell the answer, but we'll get into the details next class. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of a shift here. If you don't have any questions, we still have about 15 minutes to talk about something else. So I bet that what I so far talked about was not particularly well known to you guys. That's because it's not well known to most people. That is, Mexico as a country of sort of immigration, right? We think of Mexico mostly as a country of emigration, right? Emigration, people leaving, right? So, again, to recap, Mexico wanted immigrants, but failed to attract immigrants. We wanted immigrants with a very specific profile, and then really in the post-revolutionary era, it really developed a system that, if anything, it was sort of characterized by restriction, right? Restriction anchored in kind of like political, ideological reasons, some economic elements as well, right? But really what was sort of consolidating, right, in Mexico and in the North American region was Mexico's role as a net exporter of migrants, right, or workers, right? Citizen workers, as some people call them, right? Primarily, and when I say primarily, the word primarily, it's kind of like an understatement because it's almost all Mexicans, right, who were leaving Mexico for some destination abroad to work, were coming to the U.S., right? Up until very recently, more than 95%, at some point it was more like 98.5% of Mexicans who were abroad were in the U.S., right? So Mexican migration to the U.S. gets started in the 19th century, the 1800s, right? Very, there's some discussion among scholars of migration of when the phenomenon actually started. It's not that important for us. But already during the Civil War, during the U.S. Civil War, Mexicans actually worked in the Confederacy, for the Confederacy, right? Transporting goods, munitions, taking things from Mexico, various commodities that were needed in the war, from Mexico to the U.S., right? But what really detonated migration from Mexico to the U.S. was actually a very active effort to recruit Mexicans to come and work in the United States by U.S. companies, right? These companies, in the context of the sort of booming U.S. economy of the late 1800s, first went to states in northern Mexico, the states that, not surprisingly, right, they're closest to the U.S., right? So they went to Chihuahua, they went to Sonora, all the states in northern Mexico, but quickly encountered a problem. The problem being that these were sparsely populated states, right? There was not a lot of people, essentially, right? And then, after tapping that source of labor and realizing that it would not satisfy the needs of this sort of booming U.S. economy, these companies actually send recruiters, agents, to a much more densely populated area, which is the region of central western Mexico, right? And I know that some of you guys have your roots in some of these places, right? But I'm talking about states like Zacatecas, Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato, right? Those states, right? That were the states that were tapped by recruiters coming from the U.S., right? The agents of U.S. companies actually continue to be, for almost 100 years, the primary source of migration from Mexico to the United States, with migrants coming a little bit from here, a little bit from there. But this region of central western Mexico actually provided the bulk of migration for many decades to come. Okay? Now, so this is sort of similar what the U.S. did with European migration and even migration coming from Asia, right? Big companies sending recruiters, agents, right, to bring some of these workers. Recruitment actually was banned in the U.S. Officially in about 1885. The U.S. Congress passed another act, another law forbidding recruitment, because recruitment was seen as a kind of indentured labor, kind of like semi-slavery, if you will. But in reality, recruitment continued, right? That's one thing is the law and one thing is reality. So reality continued. Now, what is interesting about the Mexican case, of course, if you think about the different streams of migration that were happening at that time and that were, coming to the U.S., or they were directed to the U.S., is that Mexicans were seen as a good source of migration, but not good for immigration, right? Do you understand the difference between migration and immigration? You can articulate that difference. Yes?
I think migration is you have the intent to go back, you're like back and forth. Immigration, your intent is to stay and integrate.
There you go. Exactly. So immigrants, basically are people who, let's say, roughly, generally speaking, come and settle, right? They are, by the members of the whole society, are seen as viable candidates to, over the course of a generation, perhaps, or two, transitioning the spectrum in terms of being foreigners first to being nationals later, right? Sort of full members of that society. Mexicans were not in that category, right? Mexicans were an ideal source of labor because they came from next door, right? So if you needed to get rid of them, you could just put them on a train or some buses later on and send them where they came from. But Mexicans were not ideal from the sort of racial point of view that we have discussed today, right? They were not white, and in the eyes of many in the U.S., were actually seen as a kind of had this sort of spoiled racial profile, right? Because the European race, right, had been sort of tainted by intermingling by mixing with indigenous people. Now, despite that fact, there was a very significant volume of Mexican migration during this period, right? We're talking about beginning towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and Mexican labor, of course, played a very important role during periods of scarcity, labor scarcity in the U.S., especially around World War I and World War II, right? And so this is interesting because it is connected to how Mexico and Mexican migration, Mexican labor actually have been connected to U.S. hegemony and geopolitics, right? In 1942, right, the U.S. and Mexico agree on a bilateral program to import with visas and contracts workers who would alleviate, right, that labor scarcity in the context of World War II. Bracero program, as it was known, right, was signed between the two countries in 1942. Okay. Interestingly enough, it was extended until way after the World War II ended, right? It ended in 1964. So it was in place with a different sort of incarnations for about 22 years or so. And there had been already in in the context of World War I, a first Bracero program, but this was the really large program because it extended contracts to about, there were about 4.6 contracts. Many of these migrants were repeat migrants, so don't think that this figure is actual people. Actual individuals was more around 2 million. But 2 million is a huge figure if you think about the population of both countries at that time, right, in 1942. 2 million people in Mexico was like a lot of people, right, compared to the population. And what is also interesting, of course, is that the Bracero program, as agreed upon by the two countries, was presented as a kind of Mexico's contribution to the war effort, right, during World War II. Right? So Mexico was part of the larger alliance of countries led by the United States. And although Mexico did send some Air Force, actually, of all things, combatants in the Pacific, on the Pacific theater, but actually it was not engaged in the sort of conflict in Europe, although later in the war it declared war against Germany and its allies. But this was sort of the big contribution, right, of Mexico to the war effort. Oh, I'm missing a number there, 1942. So the Bracero program, right? There were some very interesting photographs that were taken in this period. The Braceros were hired to work mostly fundamentally in agriculture, destined for agricultural labor, and a smaller contingent worked in railroad maintenance as well. Many Braceros, of course, testified or attested to the sort of humiliations of recruitment, including being sort of sprayed with DDT during the process of recruitment. And once again, mostly hired for agricultural labor in the U.S. In fact, when recruitment happened, when at the time of being recruited, the workers were asked to show their hands. Men were asked to show their hands, right, to show that there were calluses and evidence that people actually worked in agriculture, right, that were used to this sort of hard labor. Okay, I'm going to stop here, but don't move, don't go. So I will be sending you a prompt for a second short paper, okay, with instructions. And so that will probably happen today, later today. And so stay tuned for that, okay? Otherwise, I'll see you on Tuesday. Readings are there. Please read. It's important that you read. Yes?
Go back to slide.
Of course. The one previous? Or two?
Two.
You mean like this?
This one, yeah.
Well, let's see. I'll go.